I've spent the last 2 years as a full-time editor and colorist, and these are the top 3 mistakes I've seen beginner colorists make in their grades. Now, everyone makes mistakes. I actually just finished shooting this video and only now realized that I shot it slightly out of focus. So while I go watch a YouTube review on some camera monitors for my YouTube setup, let's go over the first mistake: not correctly balancing your footage. This is super important to get a neutral white point in your image and making sure all the colors are where they're supposed to be. Now, I see a lot of beginners using temperature and tint and trying to eyeball things, but there is a tool in DaVinci Resolve that makes sure you get your balance right every single time. That tool is the vector scope. So if you can't see your vector scope, all we have to do is come down to the bottom right here and change this from waveform to vector scope. And you'll see here we get basically a representation of the color wheel and a depiction of where all the colors in our image are sitting in relation to that color wheel. You can see we have our red, magenta, blue, cyan, green, and yellow. If your image is, say, too yellow or green, it'll lean over to the yellow or green side of the vector scope. If it's got too much magenta or blue, you can see it'll lean over to the magenta and blue side of the vector scope. So the goal when we are balancing our footage is to get this little blob of color right in the middle, because 99.9% of the time, that'll mean our image is probably balanced. So we're going to stay away from our temperature and tint controls because they do some really funky things, especially when we need to push the image quite far to get it to a neutral point. Now, what I used to use most of the time was the HDR palette instead. The HDR palette is great for making corrections to your image that affect it like settings in a camera would. Basically, the exposure on the global wheel here is very similar to the f-stop on a camera. If we move the exposure up by 1, it basically mimics 1 stop of exposure. It also affects the colors of the image as a whole really naturally too. It doesn't muddy up the shadows, which we will get to later on in the video. However, a technique I've learned recently is changing the gamma space of the node. And we can do that by coming down here to gamma and changing it to linear. So now our gain wheel is working as the HDR global offset, which means if we move the point in our color wheel around, it's now going to start affecting the colors of our image as a whole, and we can begin to start balancing. There are quite a few extreme colors in this image. I'm just going to be focusing on the main white blob in the center here and just getting that to a point where roughly everything fits within the middle of the vector scope, somewhere around here. Now, doing a before and after, you can see we've made quite a large shift. There was quite a lot of blue and purple in our image before, and now we've brought a lot of the warmth in his skin tones back, and the whites are more neutral, as we can see over on the left here. The second mistake I see a lot of is having muddy shadows. Often when beginners are creating their creative grades, they're pushing a lot of color into the image but not neutralizing their shadows, which in my opinion is the biggest differentiator from a pro and an amateur grade. Clean, neutral shadows really grounds the look and makes it feel natural. Now, for the purpose of this tutorial, I am absolutely cranking the look here just to give you a good idea of what muddy shadows would look like. Now, if we zoom in here, you can see in my look, I've gone and used the lift to introduce some cyan in the shadows here, but what it's done is created this cyan wash over all the parts that are supposed to be neutral black. So the best way to keep these shadows neutral is actually to switch over to our log wheels, and we're just going to use the shadow wheel down here just to counterbalance what's happening in our shadows. So if we're getting close here, we can see his eyebrows and his pupils and the dark parts of his eye here, his hairline are all getting quite blue, and so we can counteract that with our shadow wheel. Looking back and forth between the vector scope and the image, I'm just going to bring them back and kind of counterbalance that coolness until the shadows look like a neutral black again. I don't want to go too far because they'll look too warm and gunky, so we'll keep it on the cooler side of things, but just bring them back enough so that it's not a noticeable effect. So I'm just going to do a before and after here, and you can see we've really removed that wash of cyan in the shadows there, and we've still retained our warm green look, but it just doesn't look like an Instagram filter now. That's really grounded. The shadows are where they're supposed to be, but we've really shifted those colors into our own creative look. If we do a before and after with the shadows and the look itself, we've created something totally different, but it still feels grounded in reality. So the third mistake I see beginners make is clipping their highlights. Let's look at 2 different ways we can stop this from happening. So the shot I've got here is from the same scene, by the way, from my short film Interrupted from last year. You can check that out here. You can see that we've got a very strong lamp source over on the right here, kind of providing this warm backlight to our character here. And I just want to take some emphasis off that because we really want to be focused on our main character and not the lamp. So our first method is going to be using power windows. So down the bottom here, we can go over to our power window tab, and here we get a whole bunch of options to choose from. In this instance, either the curve or the gradient tool would work quite nicely. I'm going to go with the gradient tool for this one. I'm just going to shuffle that around, make it nice and soft, and just kind of place it over our lamp here. By the way, Shift H can show you what you're really selecting. So I'm just going to move it over not too far, make it nice and soft. Okay, Shift H again to get out of that. And then all we have to do is just bring our highlight slider and pull that back a little bit. And just take some of the emphasis off that. You can see we're getting all the detail back and even more of the color too, which is awesome. So if we do a before and after, you can see it's really taking the emphasis off that light and bringing a lot of detail back that we had lost. And you can see that change happening in the waveform too. Another way to make this change is by using the qualifier tool. So just to the left, we can go over to the qualifier. And in this instance, since we're only affecting highlights, we don't need to concern ourselves with hue and saturation. We can instead just use the luminance. And again, I'm going to go Shift H to see what we're doing, and just going to drag this low point up until we're pretty much selecting the highlights here. Basically anything that's clipped, we're going to select, but it is giving us this very harsh edge around the selection. So I'm going to take our low soft, and I'm just going to really soften that selection out. It's quite a bit, so I'm just going to pull it in, just refine it till we're really only selecting what we need. I'm going to hit Shift H again. Now that we've got a selection of our lamp, we can once again use the highlights tool to really soften that down. It's a very similar effect, and you can see we've really brought all that information back. So these are quite small changes, but they make a huge difference in the quality of your grade. By the way, if you do want to dive deeper into my color grading workflow, you can check out this video. And as always, if you have any questions or suggestions for future videos, leave them down in the comments, and I'll see you on the next one.